An old man sits alone on a park bench, ignored by everyone. A young man in civilian clothes walks past, then suddenly stops. He turns, walks back, and stands in front of the old man. The young man raises his hand and gives a sharp military salute. The old man looks up, eyes widening, overcome with emotion. Welcome to Tales by Orion. Let's uncover what really happened. The old man, Arthur, sat on the park bench, the late autumn sun doing little to warm his tired bones. His worn tweed jacket, a relic from a different era, was buttoned up to his chin, and his hands, gnarled by time and hardship, rested on the familiar curve of his oaken cane. He watched the children playing near the fountain, their laughter like distant wind chimes, a sound that belonged to a world he no longer fully inhabited. For years, he had been a fixture in this park, as unnoticed as the pigeons that strutted at his feet, pecking at invisible crumbs. He was just the old man on the bench, a faded photograph in the bustling album of city life. Few knew his name, and none knew the stories etched into the lines on his face, stories of duty, sacrifice, and a courage that now lay dormant, buried beneath layers of quiet anonymity. He wasn't bitter, not anymore. There was a certain peace in being unseen, a liberation from expectation. Yet, sometimes a wistful pang would echo in the hollows of his memory, a longing for a connection, a spark of recognition that the world had long since withheld. He had served his country with unwavering loyalty, had faced perils that would make most men tremble, had held the lives of others in his hands and brought them safely home. But those days were like a dream, vivid yet intangible, a chapter closed and gathering dust on a forgotten shelf. The world had moved on, as it always did, and he had moved with it, albeit at a slower, more contemplative pace. He picked up a fallen maple leaf, its vibrant red a stark contrast to the gray concrete at his feet. It was beautiful, perfect in its fleeting glory, soon to be swept away and forgotten. A metaphor, perhaps, for lives like his. He often wondered if any of the values he'd fought for, the principles he'd upheld, still resonated in the modern clamor. Did honor still mean anything? Did quiet strength still command respect? Or was it all drowned out by the noise of self-promotion and instant gratification? He sighed, a soft exhalation that mingled with the crisp air. Today was like any other day, or so he thought. He watched a young man, powerfully built and walking with a distinct, disciplined gait, enter the park. The man wore civilian clothes, but there was an unmistakable aura about him, an alertness in his eyes, a straightness in his posture that spoke of a background Arthur recognized instantly. He'd seen that look in a mirror decades ago, seen it in the eyes of his comrades. The young man scanned the park, his gaze briefly passing over Arthur without lingering, just another elderly citizen enjoying a moment of repose. Arthur felt no disappointment. It was the expected response. He was part of the scenery. But then, the young man's path curved, unexpectedly, towards Arthur's bench. Arthur tensed slightly, a flicker of ancient instinct. Was he about to be asked for directions, or worse, a handout? He prepared his polite, non-committal refusal. The young man stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. He wasn't looking at Arthur's face, but slightly lower, at his jacket. Arthur subconsciously glanced down, wondering if he'd spilled his morning tea. What was it that held the stranger's attention, breaking through the veil of anonymity that usually shrouded him? Have you ever felt invisible in a crowd, only to have someone truly see you for a moment? Share your experience and what it meant to you. The young man's eyes, sharp and intelligent, lifted from Arthur's jacket to meet his gaze directly. There was no pity in them, no casual dismissal, but an intensity that made Arthur sit a little straighter, the years momentarily falling away. For a beat, neither spoke. The sounds of the park, the distant traffic, the children's laughter, the rustle of leaves, seemed to fade into a respectful silence. Then, the young man's posture shifted. His shoulders squared, his hand moved with crisp precision, and he rendered a salute. Not a flamboyant gesture, but a perfect military salute, palm flat, fingers aligned, touching the brim of an unseen cap. It was an acknowledgement, a sign of profound respect, delivered with an earnestness that resonated deep within Arthur's soul. Arthur was stunned. His mind, usually so quick, struggled to process the moment. A salute. Here? Now? To him? He hadn't received such a gesture in decades, not since he'd hung up his own uniform. His eyes, misty with unshed tears, locked with the young man's. In that shared gaze, a silent understanding passed between them, a bond forged in the crucible of shared experience, transcending age and circumstance. Onlookers, the few who happened to notice the quiet drama unfolding on the park bench, paused in their routines. A mother hushed her child. A jogger slowed his pace, their curiosity piqued by the unusual sight of a young, fit man saluting an elderly gentleman. They didn't understand the significance, the weight of history and honor encapsulated in that simple act, but they sensed its power. Arthur, his composure momentarily fractured, managed a slow, deliberate nod, his own hand instinctively wanting to return the gesture, though the protocols of civilian life held it back. "Sir," the young man said, his voice clear and respectful, holding the salute for another moment before slowly lowering his hand. "I apologize if I startled you." Arthur found his voice a little raspy from disuse. "Not all, son. But why?" The young man gestured almost imperceptibly towards Arthur's left lapel. Pinned there, almost hidden by the tweed, was a small, tarnished emblem, a regimental crest from a long-disbanded unit. It was so old, so obscure, Arthur himself sometimes forgot it was there. "That insignia, sir," the young man explained, "and the way you carry yourself. There are things you don't forget, things you learn to recognize." He paused, then added, "My name is Kyle Ramirez. Active duty, Navy SEAL. A SEAL, one of the elite." Arthur felt a surge of pride, not for himself, but for this young warrior standing before him, embodying the same spirit of service he had once known. The world hadn't forgotten everything then. Some still remembered. Some still understood the language of quiet dignity and enduring commitment. Kyle's recognition was like a key unlocking a dusty room in Arthur's heart, letting in a sliver of light. It wasn't just the pin. It was something more, an innate understanding that passed between men who had walked similar paths, however different their eras. The young SEAL saw not just an old man, but a legacy. What unexpected sign of respect have you witnessed or received that left a lasting impression? We invite you to share those powerful moments. A torrent of memories, sharp and vivid, flooded Arthur's mind, triggered by the young SEAL's unexpected salute and the mention of his service. He was no longer on a park bench in the city. He was back in the dense, suffocating jungles of a forgotten war, the air thick with humidity and the stench of fear. He saw the faces of his men, young, determined, scared, looking to him for guidance. He was Sergeant Arthur Jenkins then, barely a man himself, yet responsible for so many lives. One particular memory surfaced with brutal clarity, a night patrol gone disastrously wrong. They had walked into an ambush, the darkness erupting in a terrifying cacophony of gunfire and explosions. Chaos reigned. Men were screaming, falling. His radio operator was hit, the communication link to safety severed. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cut off. Panic was a living thing, threatening to consume them all. But Arthur, fueled by a desperate resolve, refused to let it win. He remembered rallying his remaining men, his voice somehow steady above the din of battle. He remembered dragging a wounded private, a boy barely 18, to the relative safety of a shallow ravine, bullets whizzing past his head like angry hornets. He recalled organizing a desperate defense, directing fire, tending to the injured with shaking hands but a calm demeanor he didn't feel. The night stretched into an eternity, each minute paid for in blood and terror. He remembered the agonizing decision to attempt a breakout under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, knowing it was their only chance, however slim. He'd led the charge himself, not because he was fearless, he was terrified, but because he knew his men needed to see him move, to believe survival was possible. He'd taken a piece of shrapnel in his leg, a searing pain that he'd ignored, adrenaline and duty overriding physical agony. They had fought their way through, losing good men, but saving more. He remembered carrying another soldier, unconscious and bleeding, for the last mile, his own strength failing, his vision blurring, but his will unbroken. They had made it back, broken and battered, but alive. There were no parades for that kind of bravery, no headlines. Just a quiet commendation, a new scar, and the heavy weight of remembrance. That was the reality of his service, stripped of romanticism. It was grit, sacrifice, and an unshakable commitment to the men beside him. It was the kind of experience that forged a man, that left an indelible mark on his soul, a mark that Kyle, the young SEAL, had somehow glimpsed through the veneer of age and anonymity. Arthur's quiet park bench demeanor was a testament not to a life passively lived, but to a life that had faced the storm and found a hard-won peace on the other side. His current stillness was the calm after that storm, a deep reservoir of strength and resilience that few could comprehend. The tattered insignia on his lapel was more than just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of that past, a quiet testament to the fire he had walked through. When you think of heroism, what image or story comes to mind, and why does it resonate with you? Back in the present, the vibrant autumn park reasserted itself around Arthur and Kyle. The young SEAL's respectful gaze hadn't wavered. "It's an honor, sir," Kyle said, his voice sincere. Arthur finally managed a small, genuine smile, the first in what felt like a long time. "The honor is mine, son, to see young men like you still upholding the traditions, still willing to serve." He paused, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. It's been many years since anyone noticed that old pin. Most people these days, well, they have other things on their minds. Kyle nodded in understanding. "It's easy to get caught up in the now, sir, but some of us make it a point to study the history, to learn from those who came before. Your generation, what you went through, it paved the way for us." His words were a balm to Arthur's old wounds, a quiet affirmation that his sacrifices, and those of his comrades, were not entirely forgotten. They spoke for a few more minutes, a brief but profound connection forming between the old veteran and the young warrior. Kyle didn't press for war stories, and Arthur didn't offer them. There was no need. The shared understanding of service, of commitment, transcended the specifics of their respective conflicts. Kyle spoke a little about the rigors of SEAL training, the dedication required, and Arthur listened intently, recognizing the same timeless demands of discipline and resilience. He saw in Kyle the same fire that had once burned in him, now refined and honed for a new era of challenges. As they talked, Arthur felt a subtle shift within himself. The heavy cloak of invisibility, which he had worn for so long it had become a second skin, seemed to lighten. He felt seen, not just as an old man on a bench, but as Arthur Jenkins, a man with a history, a man who had once mattered. Kyle's simple act of recognition had reawakened a dormant part of his spirit. "I have to get going, sir," Kyle said eventually, a note of regret in his voice. "But I'm glad I stopped. It's important to remember." He offered his hand, and Arthur grasped it firmly. The young man's grip was strong, confident. "Thank you, Kyle," Arthur said, his voice holding a newfound warmth. "Thank you for remembering." Kyle gave a slight nod, then turned and continued on his way, his powerful figure receding into the distance. Arthur watched him go, a complex mix of emotions stirring within him. The encounter had been brief, unexpected, yet it had touched him profoundly. It was a reminder that even in the quiet autumn of his life, sparks of connection could still ignite. He looked down at the old insignia on his lapel. It seemed to gleam a little brighter now. Perhaps the world hadn't entirely forgotten. Or perhaps, more importantly, he was beginning to remember himself. How can different generations better connect over shared values or experiences, especially when those experiences are as profound as military service? Share your thoughts on bridging these gaps. The warmth of Kyle's recognition lingered, but as the day wore on, it also stirred older, more complicated memories for Arthur. The transition from the structured, purposeful life of a soldier to the often bewildering ambiguities of civilian existence had been a difficult one. After his final tour, he'd returned home to a country that seemed indifferent, sometimes even hostile, to the sacrifices made in distant lands. The camaraderie, the shared sense of mission that had defined his life for so long, evaporated, leaving a void that was hard to fill. His wife, Martha, bless her soul, had been his anchor, her love a steady beacon in the often turbulent waters of his readjustment. But even she couldn't fully comprehend the things he'd seen, the burdens he carried. The nightmares, the sudden sweats, the feeling of being constantly on edge. These were battles he fought largely alone in the dead of night. He tried to fit in, to find a new purpose. He'd taken a job as a security guard, then as a night watchman, mundane roles that felt hollow after the high stakes of his former life. The quiet routine was a stark contrast to the adrenaline and intensity he had known. He missed the brotherhood, the unspoken understanding among men who had faced death together. He tried connecting with other veterans, but many were as lost as he was, struggling with their own demons. Some found solace in alcohol, others retreated into silence. The system designed to help them often felt bureaucratic and impersonal, a maze of paperwork and waiting lists that offered little genuine support. Then Martha had gotten sick. Cancer. It had been swift and merciless. Her passing had shattered the fragile peace he had managed to build. She was his link to the present, his reason to keep fighting the shadows of the past. Without her, the world seemed to lose its color, its meaning. He'd drifted after that, severing ties, letting go of the few connections he had left. His small apartment felt too empty, too full of her absence. The park bench had become his refuge, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts, unnoticed, unbothered. He hadn't consciously chosen anonymity, but it had enveloped him gradually, like a slow tide. His service records, his medals, his commendations, they were all packed away in a dusty footlocker in a storage unit he rarely visited. They belonged to a different man, a younger Arthur, full of fire and purpose. The man on the bench was just a shadow, a whisper of who he used to be. He understood why society moved on, why old soldiers faded from view. Life was about the present, the future. The past was a story for history books, not for everyday consideration. Yet, Kyle's salute had brushed the dust off those old memories, reminding him that the story wasn't just history. It was his story. It was a part of him that could not be erased, no matter how deeply buried. The feeling of invisibility had been a defense mechanism, perhaps a way to shield himself from further pain, from the disappointment of being forgotten. But today, for a fleeting moment, that shield had been pierced, not by an attack, but by an act of unexpected grace. What are the biggest challenges individuals face when transitioning from a structured, high-stakes environment to a more conventional civilian life? The encounter with Kyle Ramirez didn't just dissipate with the young SEAL's departure. It lingered in the air, an almost tangible presence. A young couple who had been sitting on a nearby bench, pretending to read, but actually observing the exchange, glanced at Arthur with a newfound curiosity. The woman whispered something to her partner, and he nodded, looking over at Arthur with a hesitant smile. It wasn't much, but it was different. Before, he had been part of the park's inanimate furniture. Now, he was someone who had received a military salute from a Navy SEAL. That fact alone imbued him with a certain mystique. Later that afternoon, as Arthur was slowly making his way towards the park exit, a park maintenance worker, a man Arthur had seen countless times but never spoken to, paused in his task of emptying a trash can. Afternoon, the worker said, his voice surprisingly friendly. Saw that young fella salute you earlier. Impressive. Arthur, still processing the internal shift from Kyle's gesture, simply nodded. He was a good man, he replied, the words feeling inadequate. The worker continued, my granddad served in Korea. Always said you can tell a real soldier by his eyes. Guessed that young man saw something. He gave Arthur a respectful nod and went back to his work. This second, smaller acknowledgement, unprompted and genuine, further chipped away at Arthur's ingrained sense of invisibility. It seemed Kyle's act of respect had created a small ripple, subtly altering how others perceived him, even if they didn't understand the full context. He thought about Kyle, a young man from a new generation of warriors who had taken the time to learn, to see, to honor. It spoke volumes about the enduring culture within the military, a chain of respect passed down through ranks and years. Perhaps the bonds forged in service were stronger than the erosive forces of time and societal indifference. This thought brought a measure of comfort. The world outside the military might forget, but within that brotherhood, the legacy was kept alive. He considered the young people he saw every day absorbed in their phones, their music, their own worlds. It was easy to assume they were disconnected from history, from the sacrifices of previous generations. Yet, Kyle was one of them, and he had remembered. Maybe there were more Kyles out there, individuals who possessed a deeper understanding, a quiet reverence for what had come before. That evening, Arthur didn't just go through the motions of his solitary routine. There was a new lightness in his step, a flicker of the old fire in his eyes. The encounter had been more than just a fleeting moment. It was a seed of recognition, of renewed self-worth, planted in the fertile ground of his weary soul. He wondered if Kyle would ever know the profound impact his simple gesture had. He hoped somehow he would. How can small, individual acts of recognition or kindness create wider ripples of positive change in a community or even society at large? Arthur found himself thinking more and more about the systemic nature of forgetting. It wasn't necessarily malicious, he mused, but a consequence of a fast-paced world obsessed with the next new thing. Old soldiers, like old buildings or old songs, often receded into the background, their stories overshadowed by current events and contemporary heroes. He remembered the initial flurry of support when troops returned from major conflicts, the yellow ribbons, the Support Our Troops bumper stickers. But public attention was fickle. As wars dragged on or faded from headlines, so too did the sustained focus on those who had served. Benefits were cut, programs underfunded, and promises made in times of patriotic fervor were quietly shelved when budgets tightened. He wasn't angry, just observant. It was the way of things. Yet within the military community itself, a different ethos prevailed. The motto, "No man left behind," wasn't just a battlefield cry. It was a deeply ingrained principle that extended, at least in spirit, beyond active service. The problem was the chasm between that internal military culture and the broader civilian world. How could society truly understand the sacrifices made if it didn't take the time to listen, to remember, to see beyond the uniform or, in his case, the absence of one? He thought about the challenges faced by veterans trying to reintegrate, the struggle to translate military skills into civilian jobs, the invisible wounds of PTSD and moral injury, the loneliness of leaving a tight-knit unit for a world that often felt alien. These weren't individual failings. They were societal ones, reflecting a collective oversight. The young SEAL, Kyle, represented a bridge. He was part of that new generation, but had consciously connected with the legacy of the old. His salute was more than personal respect. It was a symbolic act of bridging that gap. The next day, Arthur returned to his usual bench. He felt different, more aware of his surroundings, less inclined to fade into the background. He noticed a group of students sketching near the fountain. One of them, a young woman with bright pink hair, kept glancing his way. Arthur prepared for the usual polite indifference. But then, she approached him, sketchbook in hand. "Excuse me, sir," she said a little shyly. "I hope you don't mind, but I saw you yesterday. The way that soldiers saluted you, it was really moving. Would it be all right if I sketched you? There's a certain dignity about you." Arthur was taken aback. First Kyle, then the park worker, now this young artist. It was as if Kyle's gesture had somehow made him visible, painting him in a new light for others to see. He slowly nodded. "If you wish, young lady." As she sketched, they talked. She asked him nothing about war, but about his life, his thoughts on the park, the changing seasons. It was a simple, human connection, yet it felt significant. He realized that Kyle's act hadn't just been for him. It had, in a small way, prompted others to look closer, to see beyond the surface. The importance of remembrance wasn't just for the veterans themselves. It was for society as a whole, a way of understanding its own history, its own values. What concrete steps can communities take to better honor and support their veterans? Not just with symbolic gestures, but with sustained, practical help and genuine inclusion. The encounter with Kyle and the subsequent small interactions had stirred something profound within Arthur. That evening, instead of his usual solitary meal in front of the television, he found himself drawn to an old, dusty footlocker he hadn't opened in years. It was stored in the back of his small closet, a forgotten relic of a past life. With a sigh, he pulled it out, the metal hinges groaning in protest. Inside, beneath a layer of carefully folded dress uniforms that still smelled faintly of mothballs and time, were his memories. Old photographs, letters from Martha written in her elegant script, service medals tarnished with age, commendation certificates, and a dog-eared copy of a small, leather-bound journal he had kept sporadically during his service. He picked up a photograph of his unit, a group of young men, faces grimy but grinning, their arms around each other. So many of them hadn't made it back. He traced their faces with a trembling finger, whispering their names, bringing them back to life in his mind for a fleeting moment. He found a medal that corresponded to the insignia Kyle had recognized, the Bronze Star for Valor. He hadn't thought about it in decades. It wasn't the medal itself that mattered, but the memory it represented, the desperate courage of that night patrol, the lives saved, the price paid. He read a few entries from his journal, his own word from a lifetime ago, filled with the anxieties, hopes, and raw observations of a young soldier far from home. It was like reading the diary of a stranger, yet every word resonated with a deep, personal truth. He hadn't realized how much of himself he had locked away with these mementos. In trying to move on from the past, he had inadvertently suppressed a vital part of his identity. Kyle's salute hadn't just been an act of respect. It had been an invitation to reconnect with that buried self, to acknowledge the man he had been and the experiences that had shaped him. He spent hours that night sifting through the contents of the footlocker, not with sadness, but with a growing sense of acceptance, even pride. These weren't just relics of a forgotten war. They were testaments to a life lived with purpose, to sacrifices made for something larger than himself. The feeling of invisibility he had harbored for so long began to recede, replaced by a quiet understanding that his story, his service, still had meaning, even if only to himself. But now, thanks to a young SEAL, he knew it wasn't just himself. The simple act of being seen had prompted him to see himself more clearly, to reclaim the narrative of his own life. The dust was being brushed off, not just from old medals, but from his spirit. In what ways do we all, consciously or unconsciously, compartmentalize parts of our past, and what can prompt us to revisit and reintegrate those experiences into our present selves? A few days later, Arthur was back on his park bench, the autumn air crisper now, the leaves falling more insistently. He felt a sense of anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't sure why, but he had a feeling his encounter with Kyle Ramirez wasn't a closed chapter. As if on cue, he saw a familiar figure approaching, Kyle, this time in uniform, accompanied by an older officer, a man whose bearing radiated quiet authority. Arthur's heart gave a small leap. Kyle smiled warmly as they reached the bench. "Mr. Jenkins, sir, I hope we're not intruding." "Not at all, son," Arthur replied, his gaze shifting to the officer. "This is Captain Miller, my commanding officer," Kyle explained. Captain Miller extended his hand. "Arthur Jenkins, it's an honor to meet you. Kyle told us about your service and about the insignia he recognized. We did a little research on your old unit. Remarkable history." Arthur shook the captain's hand, feeling a warmth spread through him. "The honor is all mine, Captain." Captain Miller continued, "Kyle's recognition of your service, sir, has resonated with our entire team. It reminded us of the unbroken lineage we are all a part of. We have a small gathering next week, a heritage night, where we share stories and honor those who've served before us. We would be deeply honored if you would consider joining us as our guest, perhaps even share a few words if you felt inclined." Arthur was momentarily speechless. An invitation? To share his story with active duty SEALs? It was more than he could have ever imagined. The years of feeling forgotten, of believing his experiences held no relevance to the modern world, seemed to melt away in that instant. I would be honored, Captain, he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. Kyle beamed. That's great to hear, sir. Over the next week, Arthur felt a renewed sense of purpose. He carefully retrieved his old dress uniform from the footlocker, airing it out, polishing the tarnished brass buttons. He thought about what he might say, not about glory or heroism, but about duty, camaraderie, and the enduring importance of service. He wouldn't dwell on the hardships, but on the lessons learned, the bonds forged. The Heritage Night was an experience Arthur would never forget. He stood before a room full of young, elite warriors, men who faced unimaginable dangers as a matter of course. He spoke simply from the heart, sharing a few anecdotes from his time, emphasizing the timeless values that connected their generations: courage, sacrifice, loyalty, and the unwavering commitment to one's comrades. He saw in their attentive eyes not just respect, but a genuine hunger for connection with their forebears, a desire to understand the foundations upon which their own service was built. After he spoke, many of them came up to him, shaking his hand, asking questions, sharing their own brief insights. He was no longer Arthur Jenkins, the anonymous old man from the park. He was a brother in arms, a living link to their proud heritage. The salute in the park had been the key, unlocking not just his own buried memories, but a door to a community he thought he had lost forever. The simple act of being seen had led to this extraordinary moment of belonging. What are the most effective ways for institutions or communities to ensure that the legacies and experiences of previous generations are actively preserved and passed on? In the months that followed, Arthur Jenkins was a changed man. The park bench was still his familiar spot, but he no longer felt like a forgotten relic. He carried himself with a renewed dignity, the quiet confidence of a man who knew his worth, not because of any grand public acknowledgement, but because he had been seen and respected by those whose opinions mattered deeply to him, his fellow servicemen. His connection with Kyle Ramirez and Captain Miller's SEAL team blossomed into a genuine friendship. He became an occasional, honored guest at their informal gatherings, a living repository of history and wisdom for the young warriors. They, in turn, offered him companionship and a sense of belonging he hadn't realized how much he missed. The story of the salute in the park and Arthur's subsequent connection with the SEAL team quietly spread. A local journalist, hearing whispers of it, approached Arthur respectfully. Hesitant at first, Arthur eventually agreed to share a version of his story, not for personal glory, but in the hope that it might inspire others to look closer at the quiet veterans in their own communities. The article, when published, was a sensitive portrayal of an old soldier's long-delayed recognition. It didn't sensationalize his wartime experiences, but focused on the themes of honor, remembrance, and the profound impact of a simple act of respect. It resonated with many readers. Other veterans organizations reached out, and Arthur found himself occasionally speaking at small events, sharing his perspective, encouraging intergenerational dialogue. He never presented himself as a hero, merely as a man who had done his duty, like so many others. His message was simple: remember them, listen to their stories, for in their experiences lie timeless truths about courage, sacrifice, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. He even reconnected with a few surviving members of his old unit, men he hadn't seen in decades. Their reunions were bittersweet, filled with shared memories and quiet understanding. The loneliness that had clung to him for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a web of new and rediscovered connections. Arthur Jenkins, who once thought his story was over, discovered that it was merely entering a new, unexpected chapter. He was no longer invisible, not to himself, and not to a growing circle of people who now saw him for who he truly was: a man of quiet courage, a keeper of history, and a testament to the fact that it is never too late to be recognized, to be honored, to belong. The young SEAL's salute had been more than a gesture. It had been a catalyst, reigniting a spirit and reminding a community that true heroes often walk among us, waiting only to be seen. What lasting impact do you believe such stories of recognition and intergenerational connection can have on both the individuals involved and the wider community's perception of its elders and veterans? Share your perspective, because every story of connection matters. Subscribe to Stories That Inspire for more narratives that affirm the power of respect and the enduring value of every individual's journey.